Hello, welcome to this biology session. Today we're going to be going over chapter 19. We'll be doing all three sections of chapter 19, which is the history of life. So we're starting out with how we know things about the history of life, and it's mostly from fossils. Fossils are the preserved remains of ancient organisms. And we know fossils generally preserve hard parts of organisms, such as bones, shells, teeth, and wood. This is why, for example, for dinosaurs, we have lots of skeletons, but we don't have skin and fleshy parts. There's also trace fossils, and trace fossils are evidence that an organism existed, such as footprints or poop, but not the organism itself. And if we put together all of the fossils that we know, they make up the known history of life on Earth, which is called the fossil record. So fossils help us know a lot of things. They, of course, let us know what extinct organisms physically looked like, but also how they lived and what they ate, what the ecosystems of the past were like, because we could see what organisms were together, plants, animals, and how certain features evolved as we could see differences throughout time. Now, to figure out the fossil record and the history of life on Earth, we kind of have to figure out how old things are. And there are two ways to describe how old something is. So we have relative dating, which compares ages. It compares it to something else. So, for example, we could say Margaret was born before Henry and after Arthur. So we know who was the oldest, the youngest, and the middle. And we could do the same thing with fossils and look at whether some are older or younger than others. So that's relative dating. We don't know an exact age. We don't know exactly how old the fossils are. We can just compare them to other ones. The other method is absolute dating, and that gives a numerical age. Okay, so for example, you could say Henry was born in 1491. That's an absolute date. Or you could say this fossil is 63 million years old. That's an absolute date. Now with fossils, relative dating is done by comparing the layers in which they are found. Older layers are always found underneath younger layers. Okay, so looking at these layers, we can figure out which fossils are oldest and youngest. So these down here would be the oldest, and then it's newer and newer and newer, and these are the most recent. And by looking at clearly defined layers in one place, scientists can identify index fossils, which can be used to help date layers in a different location. Index fossils come from organisms that were living for a relatively short time, but lived in many places. Okay, so for example, on this diagram, some of these fossils are in lots of different layers, like these gastropod shells, but some of them are not. So this ammonite here, okay, so this pink spirally thing, it only exists in this layer. It's not in any of the other layers. So that could be an index fossil. So these mountains all look pretty close together, but if you looked at one that was thousands of miles away, and you found an ammonite, you could guess that it was probably the same age as these. Okay, so that makes it an index fossil. You know it's not older or younger than that, and so you could help date the layers at a completely different mountain range, maybe on the other side of a continent or on a completely different continent, because it's got the same index fossils. Okay, so this is relative dating, and again, it doesn't actually help us figure out a year, how long ago the thing was. We just can compare it. Okay, this lived at the same time as this, or this lived before or after this. Absolute ages are a bit harder. They're determined by radiometric dating. So radioactive isotopes of some elements exist in nature, and so they're in all living things. For example, you have carbon-14 in your body, and that's okay. It's a natural thing. Um, these radioactive elements decay at a steady rate and each one has a known half-life. Half-life is the amount of time it takes for half of the sample to decay. So for example, the half-life of carbon-14 is almost 6,000 years. So if a body dies, in 6,000 years, half of the carbon-14 will be left. And then in another 6,000 years, half of that half will be left, and the amount keeps getting smaller and smaller. So by comparing the amount that has decayed to the amount that would have been there originally, the absolute age can be determined. Now, carbon-14 only works for things up to a certain time. We use different elements like uranium to figure out really, really old things, like the fossils of something like dinosaurs. You would have to look at uranium in the surrounding rocks to figure out how old those layers are. So when we look at the entire history of the Earth, we can come up with the geologic timescale. The geologic timescale is the timeline of all of Earth's history. There are 4 eons. And those are these levels here, the 4 eons. And the eons are divided into eras, which are divided into periods, which are divided into epochs. So right now we're in the Phanerozoic eon. That's divided into these 3 eras. And then we could take the eras and divide them into periods. So let's look at the Mesozoic. That's what dinosaurs were. That's divided into these 3 periods. And then each of those periods is divided into epochs. These divisions of when we say this period started and ended or this era started and ended, they are based on major changes in the fossil record, not on equal length of time. So we don't say like an era is exactly 20 million years. We kind of look at major changes in the fossils and say, okay, we've hit a new era. In timescales of tens of millions of years, a lot of change can happen to the environment. Some factors that have caused change are plate tectonics, moving the continents to new places around the world, comets and asteroids crashing into Earth and sending a lot of debris into the atmosphere. These and other factors contribute to climate change, especially the global rising and cooling of temperatures. You've also got biological factors that change the environment. When plants began using photosynthesis, the atmosphere changed drastically, having much less carbon dioxide and much more oxygen. Decaying living organisms can also produce soil, paving the way for more living things. So these 3 images could possibly be of the same place, but just in different eons. So quick review of section 1 before we move on to section 2. Which of the following are true about absolute ages? So 2 of these answers are correct and 2 of them are not. So I'm going to give you a few seconds to think about it. We might want to pause the video and just kind of consider which ones are right, and then we'll go over the answers. So absolute ages. They do determine how many years ago a fossil was created. So that is true for absolute ages. The next one is actually for relative dating, not absolute. So relative is when you're comparing the two. Our third option, they're determined using layers and index fossils. Again, nope, that is relative dating, where we just compare one layer to the next layer. And then determined by radiometric dating, yes, that is absolute ages. So you should know the difference between these two. Remember, relative is we're just comparing how old something is. We don't have actual dates. We could just say older or younger. Absolute, We use radiometric dating, which is the half-lives of different radioactive isotopes, and determine exactly how many years ago a fossil was created. It might not be exact, but we are coming up with a number that's at least a good estimate of the actual age. And another quick review question. We have these different labels for amounts of time. So we're going to put these amounts of time in order from the largest amount of time to the shortest amount of time. All right, so a few seconds to think about that. And there's our answer. Eons are the biggest amount of time. There's only 4 eons in the entire history of the world. Then you have eras. Eras are divided into periods. Periods are divided into epochs. All right, so now we're going into section 2. And this slide's just some vocabulary to know. I know that's kind of annoying, but it's important that you know these terms. So we have an extant species and an extinct species. So extant is the word for a species that still has living members on Earth. So humans, dogs, hippos, rose bushes, they're all extant species. We can go outside and find them. An extinct species, of course, no longer has living members. So dinosaurs, dodo birds, there's none left. When we talk about evolution, speciation is the step at which there is a new species developing from an existing species. So we've talked about how within a species, within a population, there's little changes that are made all the time, but when changes build up enough to actually start a new species from an old species, the word for that is speciation. Macroevolutionary patterns are major changes in big groups of species. So we're not just talking about one changing or dying off, we're talking about major kind of global or at least regional changes. Examples would be the extinction of all the dinosaurs, lots of different species. They're gone, things are changing. Flowering plants taking over the world. That was a macroevolutionary pattern. And then we have our 2 types of extinction. Mass extinction is when many species go extinct in a short time due to drastic changes in conditions that kind of several things happen all at once that change things too much. So a lot of species ended up dying out. Or a cataclysmic event, like maybe a giant meteor impact that changed the climate enough that lots of them died out. The other type is background extinction, and that's less of a big deal, is when one species goes extinct just due to natural selection that did not favor that species. So if we think in the scale of millions of years, background extinction is happening all the time, one species here and there. Mass extinction is like a whole lot of things going extinct at once. So this type of diagram, a cladogram, shows up in most of these chapters in this lesson. So I want to just go over this one more time. A clade and a monophyletic group. They're 2 terms that mean the same thing. They mean a group of species that include a common ancestor and all of its descendants. So we can say that if we have a common ancestor here at this X, the clade would be everything in this giant blue square here. Okay, so from that common ancestor, it branched off into a lot of different groups of species, but they all are descended from that common ancestor. So crocodiles are not because they branched off earlier, but anything to the right and above that X is a clade. Now we can make more clades within that. We can make a much smaller clade. So these things are all descended from a common ancestor, but they might not be all that closely related. But we could say, let's make a clade right here. So we have a common ancestor here, and evolution had it branched off its descendants into modern birds and the Archaeopteryx. And so we could say that this right here is also a clade. It contains all of the descendants of this common ancestor. So because this is a smaller clade, it has a more recent common ancestor and there's less things in it, we could say that these are more closely related than things that are not in that small clade but are in a bigger clade. So like the birds all the way back to these guys are less closely related. So a clade can be any size. It can contain things that are really closely related or things that are more distantly related, but these are the important parts of it. It's the group of species that includes common ancestor species and all of the descendants of it. Now, when we're talking about evolutionary patterns, there's two speeds to evolution. You've got gradualism, which is a slow, steady change building up over a long time, and your diagram here kind of shows it in the color of these shells. So you've got lots of in-between steps as we're fading from different shades of blue to kind of a teal to a green to a yellow. That's gradualism, just slow, tiny changes building up. The other version is punctuated equilibrium, where species can stay pretty much unchanged for a long time and then have a period of rapid change. So the diagram shows it again with the colors, and instead of having those in-between steps, we just kind of jump. We go right from blue to green, and then there's no changes. So these generations stay exactly the same. And then green branches off and it's yellow, and there's no in-between phase, it's just sudden changes. So that's not exactly realistic. There would have to be little in-between phases, but the idea is that it happens really quickly and then it stays the same for a long time. So you've got a lot of time where there's no changes. So here it's showing 4 generations here with no changes at all. And then a change could happen really rapidly. So the idea with gradualism is there's always slow, steady change, and then punctuated equilibrium, there's not a lot of changes for a while, and then suddenly there's lots of changes really fast. Okay, and both of these have happened. Okay, there's a lot of times of gradualism with different species, and there's times with punctuated equilibrium where they stay pretty stable for a while, and then there's changes in the environment that cause lots of quick changes. Adaptive radiation is when one ancestor species evolves into species that are very different from each other. Okay, and we see this all over the world. You've got species that have adapted over time to different environments and different niches, which means they have to develop very different traits. So a good example of this is marsupials. So we started off with an ancestor species here, so this is where we're starting our clade. We have an ancestor species somewhere in South America, and remember, South America wasn't always where it is now. The continents were more connected at some point, and it branched off into lots of things. So we had some branch off this way to become opossums, shrews, Tasmanian devils, kangaroos. Okay, they're all very different, but they came from one species that just slowly branched off into these different traits over lots and lots and lots of years. And again, this is because they're in different environments. So as they move to climates that are colder or drier or wetter, you end up having different niches to fill, so you get different traits. Now, kind of the opposite of that is convergent evolution. This is when you have species that are not closely related at all, like really very different species, but because they end up living in similar habitats, they end up having similar traits. So a great example of this is sharks and dolphins. Sharks and dolphins are very different. Sharks are fish, and they're an old type of fish. They don't even have bones, skeletons. They have cartilage. And then you have dolphins, which are mammals. Okay, so they have all of the traits of other mammals. It's believed that they started out from ancestors on land and worked their way back into the ocean. So very different backgrounds, but because they live in the same environment, they both live in the ocean, they both hunt fish, they need to have similar traits. So they ended up with the same basic body shape, the same fin placement, and they swim through the water in a similar way. So this is convergent evolution, really, really different species that ended up with a lot of similar traits because they ended up in the same environment. And one more term we've got here is coevolution. So evolution, of course, happens over a long amount of time, and things live in ecosystems where each organism affects other organisms. So when one organism in an ecosystem changes, other organisms around it are affected by that change. So some of them will evolve responding to changes in the first organism. So when the two species evolve together, just responding to each other, it's called coevolution. So something pretty cool is plants and insects co-evolved in a couple of different ways for different reasons. So plants and pollinators, such as bees and butterflies and hummingbirds, they co-evolve because they rely on each other to exist. So, as plants change their traits, the insects and the birds and moths and other things would change their traits too, to be able to still live with the plants. But then there's other insects that eat plants. So, plants and insects that eat them co-evolve because the insects need to eat and the plants need to defend themselves. So for millions of years, they've been kind of an arms race where the insects get more deadly and the plants get tougher. So it's also an example of coevolution. So quick review of section 2. Which of these things describes punctuated equilibrium? Only one of these is true. So if you need more time to think about it, just pause your video. I'm going to give you the answers here. So punctuated equilibrium. Is it constant, slow and steady change? No, that is gradualism. Is it constant, fast, chaotic change? Well, no, that actually doesn't really happen. Um, how about long periods with very little change, but in between there's short periods with rapid change? That's it. Okay, so again, slow, steady, constant change is gradualism. Staying the same for a long time and then having quick periods of a lot of change is punctuated equilibrium. And then when a species has reached perfection and change no longer happens, well, that doesn't actually happen in real life either, because the environment is always changing around species, so there's always reasons to keep adapting. And a quick review of some vocabulary here, match the terms to the definition. So one ancestor develops into a very different species, two species evolving in response to each other, and very different species develop similar traits. So which term is which? I'll give you a few seconds to think about it. Again, if you need more time to think, you can pause the video. But one ancestor develops into very different species. That's adaptive radiation. Two species evolving in response to each other, coevolution. Okay, so it's like flowers and hummingbirds. As the flowers get bigger, the hummingbirds' beaks get longer. How about very different species develop very similar traits? That's convergent evolution. And then on to section 3. So one principle of evolution is that all living things evolved from other living things that continually adapted to their environments. That's how we got all this variety. But this unbroken chain of living things had to start somewhere. And that's what this section is about. How did life start? And scientists are not really sure exactly how life originated on Earth, but they do have some hypotheses based on their understanding of early conditions. Experiments with electricity and mixtures of gases similar to Earth's early atmosphere have produced complex organic molecules, and this led to the idea that maybe lightning in the atmosphere could have also produced these molecules. So, how could these organic molecules have come together to make living things? Okay, that's a huge step. So maybe, okay, lightning can react with these gases in the atmosphere and make organic molecules form, but that's a long way from actually having living things. And so scientists are even less sure about how that happened. There's some ideas. One factor that may have helped is microspheres, which are bubbles of organic molecules that have selectively permeable membranes, just like cells, and a way to store energy, which cells also do. So these might have been kind of protocells, things that existed before real cells. Okay, some other things that scientists have kind of studied about the beginnings of life. Scientists are pretty sure that RNA evolved before DNA, and the reasons for that is, frankly, it's simpler. It's still involved in many essential reactions for life. And RNA could synthesize proteins which carry out most of the functions of modern cells. So RNA could have been the first genetic information to kind of make that start happening. If it makes proteins, cells can start being real cells. Scientists also theorize eukaryotic cells develop when tiny prokaryotic cells began living inside of bigger cells. So remember, prokaryote is cells like bacteria. They don't have a nucleus. They don't have as many organelles. Um, Eukaryotic cells do. They have mitochondria. They have a nucleus. The plant cells have chloroplasts. There are bacterial cells that also have chloroplasts. So what they think happened is that you had these big cells, and then you had these little tiny cells that are um, basically little bacteria. And these tiny cells were just kind of living and reproducing, and some of them got inside of the bigger cells somehow. And then as the big cells, divided and made more cells, they just split off and took some of these little cells with them. And so now we have the cells dividing and containing these little cells. So what they think happened is the little cells inside started to kind of specialize and work with the bigger cells and become a useful part of them. So in this case, we're thinking photosynthetic bacteria got inside of bigger cells and specialized to become the chloroplasts. Moving inside of the bigger cell. Okay, and there is some evidence for that. First of all, mitochondria and chloroplasts are the two organelles that they think happen this way, and their DNA that they have inside of them is really similar to bacterial DNA. So if there was a bacteria living outside and that's what moved into the bigger cell, that would make sense. The ribosomes of these organelles are really similar to those found in bacteria, and some organelles divide by fission, just like bacteria does. So these are all evidence that these organelles used to just be free-living bacteria that eventually moved into bigger cells and then kind of lost their ability to live by themselves and just became part of the bigger cells. And our last review questions here. So which of the following is true about oxygen in the early atmosphere? So our options are the early atmosphere did not have much oxygen. Oxygen in the atmosphere came from photosynthesis. No life could exist until oxygen was in the atmosphere, and the atmosphere's oxygen was used up by living things. Okay, so actually two of these are true. I'll give you a few seconds to think about it. And of course, you can pause the video if you need more time. So which are true? First of all, the early atmosphere did not have much oxygen. Yes, that is true. The early atmosphere had very little oxygen. There was not enough to support the kind of life that we have now. So where did it all come from? This one, oxygen in the atmosphere came from photosynthesis. So there was bacteria first, um, and then eventually plants that started photosynthesizing. They took in carbon dioxide and sunlight and water. They end up creating oxygen. And there were so many of these creating oxygen for millions of years that now the atmosphere has lots of oxygen. And then the next one is not true because, whoops, no life could exist until oxygen was the atmosphere. No, we just said that organisms created the oxygen. So there was bacteria that could exist and create oxygen, and even basic plants that could exist creating oxygen. and then the atmosphere's oxygen is used up? Nope. Again, the bacteria and the plants create the oxygen. So that brings us to the end of this chapter. If you do have any questions on it, don't hesitate to get in contact with us.